I'd like to begin by saying that honoring our dead should never offend the living. Honoring our dead should never offend the living. I love cemeteries. As a young child, I have very strong memories. I was raised in the suburbs and in the city. My Catholic parishes as a young child never had a cemetery attached to them. But I have fond memories of going with my parents to my grandparents who lived in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Trenton, New Jersey. And every time we would visit, my parents would take us, sometimes with my grandparents, to visit my great-grandparents and my great-grandparents who were buried in those cemeteries. We would decorate the graves, we would make sure that everything looked well, and we would say some prayers. Then when I was a newly ordained priest, I had my first two assignments. They didn't have cemeteries. But when I became a pastor for the very first time in Jennings County, I arrived at my rectory, and little did I know that in my front yard, 700 people were dead and buried in my front yard. And it was awesome. I genuinely love cemeteries. I live at St. Martin's campus in Yorkville here at All Saints Parish, and every single day when I wake up and when I go to bed, when I arrive at my rectory and when I leave, I see the beauty of a cemetery. A cemetery is where we bury our beloved dead, but it is literally a reliquary of saints. We believe that so many of those people will go to heaven, and when Jesus comes at the end of time and he reunites our bodies with our immortal souls, and every body rises from the grave, that there will literally be saints right there. I love cemeteries. Now, for those of you who don't know my history, the cemetery in Jennings County made international acclaim when I was there. It made Fox News, ESPN News. It was on every news station in Louisville, every news station in Indianapolis, the front page of the Indianapolis Star. We had cemetery policies, and a widow in the parish asked for a particular monument. We told her that she was not able to have this monument because it didn't fit our guidelines. She then paid for it in full without us knowing and had it delivered to the parish. And then the parish council met several times and they said, we cannot accept this monument that you have chosen. It then ended up in a 3-year lawsuit, and most grievously ended with her removing both her husband and her child who were buried in the cemetery and having them buried somewhere else. It was one of the most darkest days of my priesthood. So for those of you who are on our cemetery board here at All Saints Parish, one of the very first things that I did when I arrived at All Saints Parish, as I have vowed to do from this day forward when I was in Jennings County, one of the first things I did when I arrived is I pulled our cemetery board together and I said, what cemetery policies do you have? And the ones that we had were not very good. And I said, we need to have very clear cemetery policies and everyone needs to know them. So six years ago in October, we published the All Saints Cemetery Policy that have been completely in effect and have been really unchanged since then. In the past 6 years, between 120 and 150 monuments have been set, and every single one of those followed the guidelines. The guidelines are very simple, they're very clear. We publish them all over the place. They're on our parish website. We put them in the bulletin every single year during the month of November, which is the month dedicated to the poor souls. When you get your pre-funeral planning packet, when either you are near death or just preparing for your death, or after someone does die, the guidelines are published in there. And every time that someone purchases the right to burial, they're handed them as well. And if they purchase that, they also sign that they've read the guidelines. The guidelines are based off of the Code of Canon Law. They aren't based off of what I think is best. They aren't based on what the cemetery committee think is best. They're based on what the church teaches, which is the best. It's not an innovation or something that we came up with on our own. In the Code of Canon Law, in 1210, 1210, that's the canon number, says this: only those things which serve the exercise or promotion of worship, piety, and religion are to be admitted into sacred places. Anything that is not in accord with the holiness of the place is thus forbidden. Raise your hand if you believe that a cemetery is a sacred place. That anything secular or profane should not be admitted into that sacred place. And then the cemetery policies are then written off of that. And when someone places a monument in our cemetery, it should follow those guidelines. Now, if we think about like what is sacred and what is secular, I mean, if you just look around our church, and our churches are beautiful. I mean, if you look at our stained glass windows, there's like grapes and vegetation and flowers, and like you can have like so many things. You can have pictures of human beings. You can have saints. Like there are so many things you can have. The amount of things you can have are actually really, really small. But like, let's just like make an analogy here. Raise your hand if you think that this church is a sacred place. Okay, good. If you arrive next weekend and I erected a monument to Mickey Mouse in this church building, would you be like, Father, what are you doing? Like, that doesn't fit in here. Or if I erected like a sculpture to like the Space Shuttle Galactica, you would be like, Father, that doesn't fit here. So the same is true with our cemeteries. Now, the Catholic Church allows for American flags to be in their cemeteries. So part of our custom in our church, we have pictures of our military on a prayer board in the back of our church, and all four of them. So part of our tradition, our custom as well, is that we're allowed to have patriotic things on our monuments and in our cemeteries because we consider that to be sacred and holy. Like these are the guidelines. The guidelines are in the bulletin again this weekend. They will be again throughout the month of October, like we have done for the past 6 years. Now, some things to remember as well. We sometimes talk about, I need to purchase a cemetery plot. Just so you know, that language is totally wrong. You do not buy a cemetery plot. None of you own a cemetery plot. None of you. You own and you purchase the right of burial. You're purchasing the right to bury your beloved in the ground. Believe me, if you want to own the ground, then you can come every single week and mow it and pay for it and care for the ground. But the reality is you don't own that ground. Who owns that ground? The parish does. Actually, I do. So we purchase the right to bury someone. You do own the monument, but because you don't own the ground, what you put on our ground should be part of what we communally believe and hold to be sacred and true. The analogy would be this. Imagine if someone in the middle of the night erected a permanent monument in your front yard that you disapproved. How would that go over in your house? Now, of recent, there have been some monuments that have not been approved. As I said, there's been over 120 monuments approved in the past 6 years. Every single one has been approved. Every single one of them has been within the guidelines. And yet, of recent, there has been some situations where this has happened, where monuments have just kind of appeared with unapproved images on them. And because people are grieving and because of loss, this causes people to grieve twice. And it's very hard, terribly hard. And no one should want that for anyone. And thus I go back to my original statement. Honoring the dead should never offend the living. That's why we have guidelines we've been using for all these years. Now, when I introduced these guidelines in 2014, I clearly said these guidelines are not retroactive. We aren't going to rip out people's monuments. RAP stands for rest in peace, not rip out. We aren't going to sandblast off things that are on monuments that would not have been there if we had the guidelines that we should have had from the foundation of our cemetery, but we didn't just because we didn't. So where we're at right now is we're in the same situation. We aren't going to rip monuments out of our cemeteries. But we do need to be all on the same page as a community, as a parish, about what we believe about what should be and how we treat and honor the deceased. And as I said in 2014, for any of you who don't like these guidelines, for anybody who finds them to be offensive or you cannot tolerate them, I will give you your money back. And I apologize that somehow you didn't know when you signed that piece of paper, that you didn't know because it's been in the bulletin on the internet and everywhere else. If somehow you didn't know that this was the policy, we have no problem of giving your right to burial back. It's fine. There's no hard feelings at all. One does not have to be buried in a Catholic cemetery, but a Catholic cemetery is different than other cemeteries. The past few weeks have been one for me, to be honest, of bringing back much grief and frustration in my own life. Nights of lost sleep, doing penance for families and for loved ones that are in the midst of this double grief that I wish that no one was in. My heart tremendously aches for anyone involved. But as the father, I ultimately have to take responsibility for where we're at. We have an amazing cemetery committee, a very amazing cemetery board that works very, very hard to keep our cemeteries beautiful, and I think they are beautiful. It is my great prayer that as we enter into the month of November dedicated to the poor souls, that we can enter together as a parish community with peace and with hope, and be able to trust in the mercy and the love of God in a very profound way. So I ask us to do that. And that any of the rumors and the lies and the slander that's been going on, that it all stop and we all just move forward, with God and with grace. Because that's what we're called to do. That's how we honor the dead. I say this, and I don't mean to offend people, but the dead really don't care at all about their monument. And if we don't understand that, then we really need to question what we believe. Our hope is that the dead are in heaven and they see God face to face. And if that's the case, the last thing they care about is their name marker that marks where they're buried. Monuments do mean something to us, but they shouldn't offend other people or cause double grief in those individuals' lives. So let's pray for that grace during this upcoming month of November. Let's pray that we may truly honor the dead, that our love for the cemeteries that we have in our parish, which are beautifully cared for, may continue to be places of peace and of prayer and devotion and love. And may all the souls of the faithful departed, for the mercy of God, rest in peace.